everyone. Thank you for joining us today, Phoenix Behavioral Health. This is Therapy Chat, and I'm Dr. Dawn Parks, and with me today is Christine DesLauriers.
Hello.
LICSW and addiction specialist. And last session we had started to talk about personality disorders, and we've gone through what we call cluster C. And today we're going to be talking about cluster A, which is described as the odd/eccentric behaviors. So in this cluster we have paranoid personality disorder, schizoid, and schizotypal or schizotypal personality disorders. And so that's going to be the subject of today's discussion. And remembering that although there are 10 personality disorders and they're put into these 3 separate clusters, what they all have in common is that there is some type of a dysfunction in thinking, in feelings or emotions, in our interpersonal relationships, and we also see impulse control issues. So let's start with paranoid personality disorder, and you'll see the graphic up there that on the screen that goes through some of the pointers that would create a diagnostic, if you want, a diagnostic plan to determine whether or not a person would be classified as having paranoid personality disorder. And as we discussed last session, you don't have to fit all the criteria to fall into this classification. In fact, a lot of times we can look through criteria and say, oh, that I can relate to, and I can relate to this and this and this, but the point is that you do relate to at least 4, sometimes 5 of the criteria, and that they are pervasive. It's not just in one area, but it cuts across all different areas of life. So it affects work, it affects home life, it affects interpersonal relationships. So a lot of different areas too. And when we look at the graphic, we can see that one of the main things with paranoid personality disorder is the individual tends to believe that people are out to do them harm. So trust is a big issue, that, when you're thinking that people are out to either humiliate me or to take advantage of me or to hurt me in some way, do some kind of damage, if that's my underlying mindset, that can cause a lot of interference on a lot of different levels. And I know, Christine, you have worked with quite a few personality disorders. Thinking about this particular one and looking through this criteria, I know this is a big one, right? The trust, the trust issues.
Yes, they tend to be very distrustful, kind of perceive threats that may not be there, and also they tend to hold a grudge sometimes, and it sometimes is unrealistic in terms of how they interpret something. So that kind of feeds the paranoia and the sort of the overall fear of others that they're going to somehow harm them in some way.
Right, and that can result in them putting a lot of distance between themselves and the other person, because they don't want to be taken advantage of.
It can result in that, and it can result in some impulse control issues too.
Yeah.
Because they will sometimes react to their perceived thought process of, say, holding a grudge, or that person's out to get them, or when that may not even be the case.
Right. And, a lot of times when someone is perceiving, it doesn't matter if it's a real or imagined threat, but that can put me in defense mode. And certain times it could result in me attacking before you attack me, just to make sure that I am well protected. So you may see people who a very kind of defensive, and are going to be maybe the ones who start whatever the issue is because they want to protect themselves.
I usually try to do a lot of reframing with these types of clients in terms of how they are interpreting perhaps a situation or a remark. It's rather difficult work with them because they're pretty set in sort of their ways and their perception of things. So reframing with them is not takes a lot more effort and work than with a typical client, because they can't quite get out of their own thinking process on that.
Right. So that brings us back to one of the underlying things for all personality disorders are the cognitive distortions. And so if and I know we talked a little bit about core beliefs, those underlying beliefs. My core beliefs are that people are out to get me. You can't trust other people. They're going to try and attack me in one way or another, and I have to always be defensive. That colors my whole life. So when you say cognitive restructuring, we're talking about looking at some of those core beliefs and really starting to see if we can perhaps modify them a little bit. Right? We might not completely turn them around 100%, but a modification could be make a big difference for that person. And I think with the trust issues too, it can make it difficult for that person to confide in other people.
Yes, they oftentimes will be very suspicious of other people, and if they happen to have a partner in their life, they'll oftentimes think that partner's cheating, even if there is no evidence of that.
Yeah, that's a big thing, that there's some kind of scheme or plan or something going on. And the hard thing is, the individual really, really does believe that.
Right.
When we look at personality disorders, these thinking, feeling, interpersonal relationships, and impulse control run really, really deep. And if a person comes into treatment, that's already a big thing, because often with this type of issue, a person really doesn't feel that it's them who have the issue, that it's other people, so they don't present for treatment. They are just really having a hard time accepting that their primary relationships are also hostile and negative and untrustworthy, etc., and they don't see that what role do I play in this? It's other people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, as far as treatment, we said before that with this set of disorders, typically medication doesn't actually treat the personality disorder. It treats perhaps some of the effects from it, like.
Right, exactly. I would say with limited success, you can maybe do some anti-anxiety medication that might be able to help them in terms of their anxiety around all of their thinking processes. Sometimes some antidepressants can kind of stabilize them a little bit, but none of that is really going to make major changes in the thinking process.
No. And and sometimes mood stabilizers, depending on which of the disorders, but they can help perhaps anchor the mood shifts, mood swings a little bit more. And in some, the ones we're going to be talking about that are coming up, antipsychotics can sometimes be helpful. So let's move on to what we call schizoid personality disorder, which is, I think, probably one of the best ways to characterize it is that a person is extremely indifferent.
Mhm.
Nothing seems to really affect that person. You see people coming in, or family members coming in, saying they just are so... I can't connect with them. It's hard to connect with them. Nothing seems to move them. Yeah. And when we look at the next graphic that's up on the screen, we see that schizoid personality disorder is characterized by what's called a pervasive pattern of detachment and a very restricted emotional range.
Mhm.
So the schizoid presentation, we're not going to see someone who shows a lot of emotions. It can be very, what we call flat affect. And they are very often engaged in any activity that's solitary. So they don't need to be a part of a team. They don't need to be in a pastime or a hobby where they have a partner. They're more kind of loners. That's one of the big things with that.
It's also a more uncommon diagnosis as well.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see it too often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's fairly rare. Yeah.
They can't seem to experience pleasure in anything often, and they can almost come across as rather cold.
Yeah.
And I think that's the emotionalist piece that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, looking up at the graphic, we see that often the individual prefers mechanical or abstract activities more than human interaction. Emotionally cold, like you said, or detached personality. They may also have a hard time picking up social cues.
Mm-hmm.
They may be a little disconnected from that and have a very restricted range of emotions.
They also tend to not want to engage in sexual relationships.
Yeah. Again, for treatment, as with the others, talk therapy, with, I think, what's been found in research with all of these disorders is that probably the number one thing is the, as far as, looking at improvement with that personality disorder, is the quality of the relationship between the individual and the therapist, the importance of having that relationship, because now you have a kind of an opportunity to create with the individual what you might call a healthier relationship. And we know that CBT, looking at the way a person's thinking and what their core beliefs are, and learning how to modify that, and having the ability to be a little more aware of self. Often with personality disorders, a person doesn't have a very good ability to see themselves and how they're interacting, and how what they're saying or not saying is impacting a relationship. So in therapy we can kind of help the individual gain a little bit more insight into that, right, and a little bit more awareness into that. Medications the same as what we just mentioned before.
These people, I think, these individuals would be they're very difficult to engage in therapy.
Yes.
Probably, especially in the case, both. I mean, the paranoid, schizoid, they don't want social interactions. They're more loners. They want to, they don't trust. So, having them come into therapy is very difficult.
Very difficult.
They're probably not going to just walk in and ask for therapy because they don't really feel they have a problem.
And again, with our other cluster that we're going to talk about next session, what we call cluster B, they tend to draw more attention. They tend to probably have, criminal issues, reasons for having to come in, and maybe on probation, etc., and they need to come in as part of their requirements. But with the ones that we're talking about today, they tend to be in the background. They don't cause a lot of issues, and they're not going to come in, or very rarely will come in. In fact, I think a lot of times when I've seen these clients is a spouse, if they're married, or a family member, or some other issue that may be comorbid with it. Maybe drinking a lot, or their anxiety may be so high that they're coming in to address the anxiety. And then when you're in treatment, you see all of these other issues that are coming up.
Right.
And so the last one, schizotypal personality, again, a big pattern of social and interpersonal limitations. That distance tend to be very socially isolated, very reserved, and very distant. And again, it's not the same thing as a person who's a little bit shy, or it's different.
These the schizotypal, I think, is usually described as really kind of the unusual personality. They're odd. They have sometimes an odd way of speaking, odd pattern of speaking, dress perhaps oddly. They're definitely sort of out of step with society, and they're noticeably out of step. So they would be sort of the odd-looking person that you might see in your neighborhood or in your apartment building or walking down the street, and you just sort of notice something's off with that person. That would be fit more of the schizotypal. But they also tend to be very suspicious of others, distrust others, have a lot of those same traits as the paranoid personality. And so they tend to be also loners and not engaging with friendships and social interactions.
Yeah, and when you see our next graphic, looking at some of the pointers that are going to help the therapist form the diagnosis, besides what we've discussed in the schizoid, there tends to be perceptual or cognitive distortions a lot more. So we may see some hallucinations, things like that.
Hearing
some delusions.
voices.
Yeah. Sometimes a person will say, well, I'm not actually seeing anything, but I get this out of the corner of my eye, like something's there or something's moving, or that kind of thing. Or belief systems are very odd.
Yes, so sometimes they'll believe they almost have like a magical power on some level or there's something special about them, that is different than other people, that they have some special power or way of doing something.
Again, looking at the graphic, perceptual abnormalities may involve flashes of light, seeing shadows, and then realizing that there's nothing there. Odd beliefs, a lot of superstitious beliefs and fantasies, right? And often, not always, but often it can be seen in families where someone in the family may have had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. To a little bit more frequently, you see that. Again, though, treatment.
It's the same. Some anti-anxiety, possible antidepressant, mood stabilizer. Again, these people generally they're not coming to anyone's attention. They're quiet, they're isolated, they're a little bit odd. They kind of don't usually bother anyone, but every once in a while, there can be as we talked about, those impulse control issues that could
Yeah.
come up, that could cause an incident where they all of a sudden
Right.
come on the radar of people.
Exactly. Yeah, and often we may see they may show in therapy for something related to substance abuse, either drinking or drugs, kind of in an effort to kind of self-medicate, you know, and you see that.
I think if you want to, ask yourself questions about these personality disorders, you would, ask how, how does one perceive oneself
Mhm.
and others?
Mhm.
And are your emotional responses appropriate?
Mm-hmm.
How are you dealing with other people, especially in relationships?
Yes.
And how are you able to control your impulses?
Mm.
And those are kind of the key things to consider in terms of diagnosing this type of personality
Right.
disorder.
Right. And in some of these clusters, like we haven't talked about cluster B yet, but in some of these clusters, we see that the symptoms tend to alleviate somewhat as a person gets older. In others, they tend to become a little bit more fixed. So I think the most important thing is engaging in therapy, but engaging in therapy where a really strong, what we call a therapeutic alliance, can be formed with good boundaries, but where the individual really learns how to become more aware of those really rigid ways of thinking. I mean, we talked earlier about the distorted thinking and the fact that those thinking patterns tend to be one way. I mean, most people can relate to some of those thinking patterns, but then for a person who is not personality disordered, there's a whole lot of other options in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I can relate to that, but there's also all of these over here. Whereas what differentiates a non-personality versus a personality disordered individual is that individual only has one way.
Right.
And it's very, very hard to even, think that there is another way to think about this or another way to see this. I'm very stuck on this. So breaking that down takes time in therapy, takes a place where there's a lot of trust, because like we said before, a lot of trust issues come out here, and you see them played out with the therapist too. She's not really believing me. She's sitting there thinking I'm not being honest, and I'm inventing this stuff, and it's not really true, etc., etc. So if I've got all of that going on in my mind, it's going to be very hard to move forward in therapy. So number one, have that strong, stable relationship where change can start to happen.
I think too, anxiety plays a huge role in the escalation of these symptoms or the presentation of them. I think some of these individuals that might kind of, they're sort of this way, but they kind of stay to themselves, and they're not really there's not an impulsive necessarily act that brings them to the attention of anybody. If stress is increased on them for some reason, then you're liable to see a lot more of those paranoia come out, the impulse control issues come out, because they're feeling extremely anxious and stressed.
Right.
Maybe it's something as simple as they might get evicted from their apartment, or they might have to change something that they're very set in, where they are, and that all leads to that escalation.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes a client will come in, and when you're gathering the information, there seems to be a theme here. How come is it how come I end up getting fired from all of my jobs, or I end up always being involved with the police for some reason or another? And often, it sounds kind of obvious, but often for the individual, they don't see the pattern.
Right.
And you point that out, and you say, do you see, it might be same thing, same theme, different actors, and so, although this is happening at home now, do you see that pattern that it happened here, 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 and what's the common thread? That person can start to develop that awareness, that ability to actually see there are other ways that I can deal with these things. These other ways that I can respond to, not just to other people and other events and situations, but also to my own thoughts. I can respond differently to my own thoughts, and I can respond differently to my own emotions. And it's very difficult because it's a complete change.
Yeah, and I think there's a challenge too, because sometimes you can make some of those inroads with the thinking and some progress, and then an event will happen that will trigger them, and all the progress you've made seems like it's gone out the window because they revert right back to their dug-in sort of mentality of, it's, the world is out to get me kind of thing, and it kind of undoes all the work you've done.
I know.
So
yeah. So anyway, I think that's all we have time for today. Okay. So thank you for joining us today. Hope you found something interesting with our discussion of Cluster A personality disorders. If you have any thoughts or questions about what we talked about, if you'd like to find out more information, and also if you have any ideas or requests for us to talk about something in particular, you can contact us at drparks@phoenixinfo.online. You could also visit our website at phoenixinfo.online. Or you could call us at 508-623-3931. And thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to meeting with you next week to discuss Cluster B.
Okay.
Thank you.